Hello and welcome. Tonight I'm reading another essay from the book The Phantom World, The History and Philosophy of Spirits, Apparitions, etc., from the French of Augustin Calmet, with a preface and notes by the Reverend Henry Christmas, librarian and secretary of Sion College. And I should add a bit of context before I begin, that I forgot last time. I said that the book was published in 1850, which is true, but the original French version by Augustin Calmet was from 1751. Monsieur Calmet was born in 1672 and died in 1757. He was a monk in the Benedictine order. And I didn't even notice this until now, but there's an introduction to the book where the Reverend Christmas kind of trashes this book and says that it's an example of superstition. He has this line at the end that says, "Books like this show how far even upright minds may be warped by imperfect education and slavish deference to authority." And he is entitled to that opinion, but I'm approaching this from a neutral point of view. I'm letting the text speak for itself, and whether or not you believe any of these reports by Monsieur Calmet, that's up to you. And with that out of the way, I'll be reading a chapter about vampires, which claims to be a true report. Chapter 7. Let us now examine the fact of the Revenants, or vampires of Moravia. I have been told by the late Monsieur Duvassimond, councillor of the Chamber of the Counts of Bar, that having been sent into Moravia by his late Royal Highness Leopold, first Duke of Lorraine, for the affairs of my Lord the Prince Charles, his brother, Bishop of Olmütz and Osnaburg, he was informed by public report that it was common enough in that country to see men who had died some time before present themselves in a party and sit down to table with persons of their acquaintance without saying anything, but that nodding to one of the party, he would infallibly die some days afterwards. This fact was confirmed by several persons, and amongst others by an old curé who said he had seen more than one instance of it. The bishops and priests of the country consulted Rome on so extraordinary a fact, but they received no answer, because apparently all those things were regarded there as simple visions or popular fancies. They afterwards bethought themselves of taking up the corpses of those who came back in that way, of burning them, or of destroying them in some other manner. Thus they delivered themselves from the importunity of these spectres, which are now much less frequently seen than before. So said that good priest. These apparitions have given rise to a little work entitled Magia Postuma, printed at Olmütz in 1706, composed by Charles Ferdinand de Schurz, dedicated to Prince Charles of Lorraine, Bishop of Olmütz and Osnaburg. The author relates that in a certain village, a woman being just dead who had taken all her sacraments, she was buried in the usual way in the cemetery. 4 days after her decease, the inhabitants of this village heard a great noise and extraordinary uproar, and saw a spectre which appeared sometimes in the shape of a dog, sometimes in the form of a man, not to one person only, but to several, and caused them great pain, grasping their throats and compressing their stomachs so as to suffocate them. It bruised almost the whole body, and reduced them to extreme weakness, so that they became pale, lean, and attenuated. The spectre attacked even the animals, and some cows were found debilitated and half dead. Sometimes it tied them together by their tails. These animals gave sufficient evidence by their bellowing of the pain they suffered. The horses seemed overcome with fatigue, all in a perspiration, principally on the back, heated, out of breath, covered with foam, as they are after a long and rough journey. These calamities lasted several months. The author whom I have mentioned examines the affair in a lawyer-like way, and reasons much on the fact and the law. He asks if, supposing that those disturbances, those noises and vexations proceeded from that person who is suspected of causing them, they can burn her as is done to other ghosts who do harm to the living. He relates several instances of similar apparitions and of the evils which ensued, as of a shepherd of the village of Blow near the town of Kadam in Bohemia, who appeared during some time and called certain persons who never failed to die within 8 days after. The peasants of Blow took up the body of this shepherd and fixed it in the ground with a stake which they drove through it. This man, when in that condition, derided them for what they had made him suffer, and told them they were very good to give him thus a stick to defend himself from the dogs. The same night he got up again, and by his presence alarmed several persons, and strangled more amongst them than he had hitherto done. Afterwards they delivered him into the hands of the executioner, who put him in a cart to carry him beyond the village and there burn him. This corpse howled like a madman, and moved his feet and hands as if alive. And when they again pierced him through with stakes, he uttered very loud cries, and a great quantity of bright vermilion blood flowed from him. At last he was consumed, and this execution put an end to the appearance and hauntings of this spectre. The same has been practiced in other places where similar ghosts have been seen, and when they have been taken out of the ground, they have appeared red, with their limbs supple and pliable, without worms or decay, but not without a great stink. The author cites diverse other writers who attest what he says of these spectres, which still appear, he says, pretty often in the mountains of Silesia and Moravia. They are seen by night and by day. The things which once belonged to them are seen to move themselves and change their place without being touched by anyone. The only remedy for these apparitions is to cut off the heads and burn the bodies of those who come back to haunt people. At any rate, they do not proceed to this without a form of justicial law. They call for and hear the witnesses, they examine the arguments, they look at the exhumed bodies to see if they can find any of the usual marks which lead them to conjecture that they are the parties who molest the living, as the mobility and suppleness of the limbs, the fluidity of the blood, and the flesh remaining uncorrupted. If all these marks are found, then these bodies are given up to the executioner, who burns them. It sometimes happens that the spectres appear again for 3 or 4 days after the execution. Sometimes the interment of the bodies of suspicious persons is deferred for 6 or 7 weeks. When they do not decay and their limbs remain as supple and pliable as when they were alive, then they burn them. It is affirmed as certain that the clothes of these persons move without any one living touching them, and within a short time, continues our author, a spectre was seen at Olmutz which threw stones and gave great trouble to the inhabitants. Well, that was interesting. It was also a shorter chapter than I thought, so we have time for one more. Let's read the following chapter. Chapter 8. Dead Persons in Hungary Who Suck the Blood of the Living. About 15 years ago, a soldier who was billeted at the house of a Haidamane peasant on the frontiers of Hungary, as he was one day sitting at table near his host, the master of the house saw a person he did not know come in and sit down to table also with them. The master of the house was strangely frightened at this, as were the rest of the company. The soldier knew not what to think of it, being ignorant of the matter in question, but the master of the house being dead the very next day, the soldier inquired what it meant. They told him that it was the body of the father of his host, who had been dead and buried for 10 years, which had thus come to sit down next to him, and had announced and caused his death. The soldier informed the regiment of it in the first place, and the regiment gave notice of it to the general officers, who commissioned the Count du Cabrera, captain of the regiment of Alendetti infantry, to make information concerning this circumstance. Having gone to the place with some other officers, a surgeon, and an auditor, They heard the depositions of all the people belonging to the house, who attested unanimously that the ghost was the father of the master of the house, and that all the soldier had said and reported was the exact truth, which was confirmed by all the inhabitants of the village. In consequence of this, the corpse of this spectre was exhumed and found to be like that of a man who has just expired, and his blood like that of a living man. The Count de Cabrera had his head cut off, and caused him to be laid again in his tomb. He also took information concerning other similar ghosts, among others of a man dead more than 30 years, who had come back 3 times to his house at mealtime. The first time, he had sucked the blood from the neck of his own brother, the second time from one of his sons, and the third from one of the servants in the house, and all 3 died of it instantly and on the spot. Upon this deposition, the commissary had this man taken out of his grave, and finding that, like the first, his blood was in a fluid state, like that of a living person, he ordered them to run a large nail into his temple, and then to lay him again in the grave. He caused a third to be burnt, who had been buried more than 16 years, and had sucked the blood and caused the death of 2 of his sons. The commissary, having made his report to the general officers, was deputed to the court of the emperor, who commanded that some officers, both of war and justice, some physicians and surgeons, and some learned men, should be sent to examine the causes of these extraordinary events. The person who related these particulars to us had heard them from Monsieur the Count de Cabrera at Fribourg and Brigot in 1730. And finally, there's one more, also very short chapter, Chapter 10, Account of a Vampire, taken from the Jewish letters, Lettres Juives, letter 137. This is what we read in the Lettres Juives, new edition, 1738, letter 137. We have just had, in this part of Hungary, a scene of vampirism, which is duly attested by 2 officers of the Tribunal of Belgrade, who went down to the places specified, and by an officer of the Emperor's troops at Graditz, who was an ocular witness of the proceedings. In the beginning of September, there died in the village of Kivsiloa, 3 leagues from Graditz, an old man who was 62 years of age. 3 days after he had been buried, he appeared in the night to his son and asked him for something to eat. The son having given him something, he ate and disappeared. The next day the son recounted to his neighbors what had happened. That night the father did not appear, but the following night he showed himself and asked for something to eat. They know not whether the son gave him anything or not, but the next day he was found dead in his bed. On the same day, 5 or 6 persons fell suddenly ill in the village and died one after the other in a few days. The officer or bailiff of the place, when informed of what had happened, sent an account of it to the Tribunal of Belgrade, which dispatched to the village 2 of these officers and an executioner to examine into this affair. The imperial officer from whom we have this account repaired thither from Graditz to be witness of a circumstance which he had so often heard spoken of. They opened the graves of those who had been dead 6 weeks. When they came to that of the old man, they found him with his eyes open, having a fine color, with natural respiration, nevertheless motionless as the dead, whence they concluded that he was most evidently a vampire. The executioner drove a stake into his heart. They then raised a pile and reduced the corpse to ashes. No mark of vampirism was found either on the corpse of the son or on the others. Thanks be to God, we are by no means credulous. We avow that all the light which physics can throw on this fact discovers none of the causes of it. Nevertheless, we cannot refuse to believe that to be true which is juridically attested, and by persons of probity. We will here give a copy of what happened in 1732, and which we inserted in the Gleaner, number 18. Well, classic tales of vampirism. And there are many other stories similar to this from this book of people walking around who are supposed to be dead, and we'll be returning to these stories in future episodes. But that is all for now, and have a good night.